Hallo, liebe Hörerinnen und Hörer. Als Ergänzungsmaterial zu unserer Folge über Barbarian und zur Stay Forever Spielstaffel zu Demoniak veröffentlichen wir hier das Interview mit Peter Stone, dem ehemaligen Geschäftsführer von Palace Software. Er wird uns gleich durch die Geschichte der Firma begleiten, von der Gründung bis zu ihrem Ende, und er erzählt uns von den Spielen und den Menschen aus jener Zeit. Da steigen wir auch gleich ein. Nur noch ein kurzer Hinweis. Da das Interview auf Englisch ist, gibt's am Ende wieder eine deutsche Zusammenfassung. Wenn ihr einen Podcatcher benutzt, der Kapitelmarken unterstützt, dann könnt ihr damit direkt dorthin springen. Und nun viel Spaß mit Peter Stone.
Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Ein Podcast über alte Spiele von zwei alten Männern. Stay Forever mit Gunnar Lott und Christian Schmidt.
So, first of all, welcome, Peter. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
With me is Christian. He's my co-host on the Stay Forever podcast.
Hello.
We came your way by Richard Leinfelder, who pointed us your way, and I promised to relay his greetings. I shouldn't forget, you know. So let's get into it. We'll start at the beginning. How was Palace Software founded?
So how was Palace Software formed? Okay, maybe if I go back a few steps. So I was working at Virgin Records. Back in the 70s, Virgin had a chain of record stores in the UK, what became the Virgin Megastores. I was working there for nearly 10 years. And in the latter times that I was there, Virgin was opening bigger and bigger stores, the mega stores, and we needed to fill those stores in some way. There literally weren't enough records released to fill the stores. So I started looking around for new products to sell within the stores, and I experimented with things like hi-fi and books and those kind of things. And at that time, there was a new thing which was called video. And so films were beginning to be released on videotape, on VHS and Betamax. So I started stocking those in the stores. So that was just beginning to take off. It was very, very early in the sort of the whole history of video. And then Virgin at that time there were various partners in the Virgin group. Richard Branson was the main person, but one of his partners, it was Nik Powell. Nik was the sort of my ultimate boss in Virgin. So one day Nik contacted me and said, hey, look, he was leaving Virgin and was going to set up something new. And he was interested in this thing I was doing with video. So he said, why don't I come and join him to do this? So I did. And we started opening video stores, and which were very new at that point. And then a short time into that, I started to also stock home computers. Now, home computers were very, very new. They were sort of big boxes. I mean, there were things like big IBM mainframes and things like that, but actually having a computer in your home was a new thing. So there were a few companies that started to do it. Sharp ZX80 was, I think, the first home computer we stocked. So I then realized that kids were coming into the store. Their parents were buying the computers for them. They were learning to program, and they were coming back on Saturdays, and it was like a youth club in the store. So all these kids were bringing in their programs and written on their Sharp ZX80s and swapping them with each other on floppy disks. So that was interesting. So then a few companies started to commercially sell games. So I started to stock those as well. And that started to take off quite well. But the thing was that I'd been working at Virgin for many years. And so myself and Nik, my boss, we kind of knew how to market things. We knew how to produce things, to create a product, to create artwork, to market a product, all those kind of things. So I said to Nik, look, you know, these guys that are producing these computer games in their bedrooms, these were kids in their bedrooms producing these games and advertising them in the back of computer magazines, and with almost no artwork on the boxes, you know, it was literally sort of cassettes and that sort of thing. So I said to Nik, look, you know, I'm sure we could do better than that. You know, we could produce games and sell them with fancy boxes and that sort of thing. And so Nik said, yeah, okay, let's try it. What I didn't realize was that actually you have to know how to make games. You had to program them. So I had a lot of knowledge of the marketing side of things, but no knowledge of actually programming. Now, at that time, there was a young guy. Well, he was at school and he was working in the store, and his name was Richard Leinfelder. Now, Richard sort of dabbled in electronics and a little bit of programming and that sort of thing. So I said to Richard, well, how about if we make a game and sell it? So we started to do that. We both set up a little office in King's Cross in London, and the two of us made the first game. Now, by then, Nik, the boss, he was actually buying the rights to movies to release those movies on video. And one of the movies he had acquired was The Evil Dead, and at the time was a low-budget horror movie, but had been tremendously successful in the horror movie market. And so Nik said, well, why don't we make a game based on The Evil Dead? So myself and Richard sat down and we worked out a little scenario, and Richard started to program it, but we didn't have anyone to make the graphics. So I did the graphics. Now, I'm no artist. And it was our first game. We'd never done anything like this before. So anyway, we made this game. Richard programmed it for the Commodore 64. And yeah, we finished it. We released it. The game was pretty awful, very awful. It was not great even for that time. But, it was a learning curve. We learned a lot through making that. And I think one of the big lessons we learned was that we needed better graphics than I could produce. So I started to hunt around for an artist who could join us. And we found a guy called Steve Brown. So Steve came and joined us. He was a kind of comic book artist, I'd say. He was quite talented in that way. So Steve joined us, and it turned out that Steve was more than an artist. He didn't really know much about computer games, but very quickly he learnt about it. He spent his time going around arcades, looking at arcade games, how they work, and came up with a scenario. So Steve and Richard sort of formed a partnership, the two of them, to make the next game, which was a game based on witches and pumpkins. So that game was made and turned out to be pretty good for the time, and that was Cauldron. Now, Cauldron started to sell pretty well, got some great reviews. It started to sell pretty well. So then Nik said to me, look, we're selling all these games in the UK. I go around Europe, find distributors, and started selling Cauldron around Europe. So I found a distributor in France and Spain and in Germany. And in Germany, there used to be a big mail order company, a retailer in Germany. I don't know if they still exist, called Queller. Are they still in Germany?
Don't exist anymore, but they were very big.
Yeah, in the 80s, they were very big. And so I contacted Queller, and they were very interested in stocking Cauldron. But they said, well, why don't we translate it into German? So we came up with the name Hexenkuka. And so we did a little translation of that. And it sold tons. It sold huge numbers in Germany through Queller. And it was great.
To be honest, I was always a bit confused about the relationship between Palace Software and Palace Group, which seemed to be two different entities, but somehow connected. So I understood that Palace Group basically was that video store business, and Palace Software was the subsidiary creating games. Is that correct?
Right. Well, okay. So what Nik had done, he'd actually branched out into different directions. So he created the Palace Group, and the video store was called the Video Palace. Initially, we were in Kensington in London, and then we moved to Oxford Street, which is the main shopping street in London. So that was something that I was looking after before Palace Software. But Nik branched out into other things. As I say, he was acquiring the video rights to movies. So initially, a lot of the movies he was getting the rights to were, I would say, art house movies. So by people like Wim Wenders and French directors, that sort of thing, And then later on, so this is kind of moving into the future beyond where I've already gone, he started to actually make movies. And he had various other parts of the group, all sort of based around video and movies, so production companies and so on. So it became pretty big by, I'd say, the late 80s. So Palace Software was part of the group. So Video Palace, Palace Software, Palace Productions, and Palace Video, they were all different parts of the same Palace group.
Was it like the exotic outlier department of the whole group, or were you pretty integrated, meeting colleagues every day?
No. The thing was that most of the people in the group, were kind of video and movie people, and they didn't understand computer games at all. Yeah, so we were the outlier part. In fact, actually, there is a book about the Palace Group that came out, and after the Palace Group didn't exist anymore. In that book, They talk a lot about the making of the movies and the video and all those kind of things. And obviously the writer himself, who was like a sort of a movie kind of writer, didn't know anything about the computer game side. He got everything wrong in his book. So didn't understand computer games at all and what we were doing.
And before you created Palace Software, what was your role at Palace? Were you managing stores?
Just managing the store, yeah. So I went from Virgin to creating the store, managing the store, and then creating Palace Software, 1, 2, 3, one after another.
You mentioned that the first game that you created was Evil Dead. I've read, actually I've seen it mentioned by a guy called Chris Neary, who was apparently also working for Palace Software in these early days, that he was creating a game based on Halloween on the movie. Is that correct?
That's probably correct, yes. I'm sure if Chris said that, it's true. I can't remember, to be honest.
Okay. Yeah, he mentioned that that was created in parallel, but then was cancelled. But then the idea carried over to Cauldron, ultimately.
Yeah, it sounds as though it's probably correct because, you know, having released The Evil Dead, we probably looked at, within the life of Palace Software, there were lots of things we tried that actually were never released. So that was almost certainly one of them, yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned that you were moving into offices in King's Cross. Is it correct that that was in the same building as the Scala cinema?
Yes, it was. So the story there was that when we left Virgin, Nik went into partnership for the film side, the video and film side, with a guy called Steve Woolley. And now Steve is a very interesting guy. He was really knowledgeable and very enthusiastic about movies. But Steve had this sort of project that he'd been running, which was the Scala Cinema at King's Cross, which was an art house cinema. And so they had a spare room spare 2 rooms within the cinema building. So initially we used those, actually we always used those rooms, but what happened over time was that we began to expand and we took other small offices locally as well. So the Scala office started as our main office, but then later became more like a subsidiary office for some of the programming team. It was a great office. You know, it allowed us to go into the cinema as well, so we could go and watch movies at the same time.
Yeah, I was just about to ask, were there any perks involved of working next to a cinema? Okay.
Did you publish, like buy a game from somebody else and bring it to market, or did you everything in-house, like programming and everything?
Well, the first games were The Evil Dead, Cauldron, Cauldron 2, and Barbarian. All of those were produced in-house we were building a bigger and bigger team to make those games. After that, we started to branch out. We started to work with other teams. Yeah, so it kind of went in lots of different directions at the same time. But initially, we were sort of building a team of people.
Speaking of team of people, I think if I'm not mistaken that in these early days, a typical development team for a game at Palace would be a programmer, a graphic artist, and a musician. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah. So I can't remember the name of the first musician we had, but quite quickly, Richard Joseph came onto the team. And Richard was fantastic. So he became a very important part of the team quite early on.
You mentioned previously that Steve Brown had a comic book art background, and Dan Malone, who also came on board as an artist, was also interested in comic books. He said in an interview that he had responded to an ad which he saw, which you placed, which specifically said 2000 AD style artist wanted.
Exactly.
So why were you interested in this particular style of art?
Yeah, that's the kind of idea I had. So that's how first Steve and then others came on board, because my vision was if an artist was good at comic book art, then there's a good chance that they could adapt to computer games as well. And that's what happened. I mean, with Dan in particular, that was quite interesting. So I placed an advert in a magazine that I knew that artists, commercial artists, were reading. And it wasn't Dan who responded to the advert. He was at college. So it was his lecturer who contacted me. She was a lady, and she said, look, I've got this guy who is on my course. He's absolutely useless at being on my course, but he's fantastic at comic art. Why don't you see him? Dan came in and he bought his portfolio, and she was right. He was fantastic. His art was great. So he joined the team.
He went on to become one of the best recognized computer graphics artists of the 90s, I would say, at the Bitmap Brothers.
Right.
You talked a little bit about your vision. What would you say made Palace Software special?
Well, I think in the early days, it was the fact that we had a sort of a really close-knit, very tight in-house team. Other companies, such as, for example, Ocean or US Gold, they would buy licenses and they would make a game of those. Some of their games were good and some not so good, but it was really the guys within the team, and it was particularly the artists who came up with the ideas. So, Steve Brown was the initial creative person, then it was Dan, then other people came along, and there was another guy called Joe Walker. I don't know if you know of Joe. So they were the guys who were coming up with the ideas. So I think that was one of the key things. So it was their art and it was their ideas working together very closely with the programmers. So in the games that actually got released, you got a strong partnership between the graphics and the art. And so they're all sort of original kind of ideas. In other words, what I mean by original, I mean they weren't licenses, like they weren't movie licenses or that kind of thing, So, and each of the early games we released, they all had great reviews. So, in those first 2, 3, 4 years, it worked very well.
What determined whether a game would be released or not?
Well, I think we kind of decided as we went along. As I said earlier, one of the problems we had was that a lot of the ideas didn't work. There were quite a few games that were started and were never released because they just didn't work. During the time that the game was being made, we could see that it was going to work or not going to work. So if a game didn't work, then we gave up and we moved on to the next thing.
So a team decision, essentially.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a team decision, maybe a management decision that, we would have to say to the people involved, sorry, guys, it's not working. Let's give up.
So speaking of management, what was your role in that?
So I set up the company, thinking of management. So Richard Leinfelder was really the main technical person. So Richard worked on Evil Dead and then Cauldron. But then after Cauldron, we began to take on more programmers. So Richard became more sort of like the technical director, if you like. And then another guy joined who had also worked in the Video Palace in the store. And his name was Matthew Timms. And Matthew joined in a kind of management role. And over the time of the life of Palace Software, Matthew and I kind of kept swapping roles. So although I was kind of the managing director, so initially I was looking after the more creative side above Richard and Steve, but then Matthew started to take over on that side. I was concentrating more on sales and marketing, but Matthew and I kind of mixed up our jobs at different times. So most of the time I looked after the PR, going around to magazines and that sort of thing, demonstrating the games. But then sales, sometimes I did sales, sometimes Matthew did sales. And then later on, and we're kind of moving on to later stages, Matthew had this idea of working together with other developers. So he started to go out. In fact, he created a kind of sub-brand, which was called Outlaw Productions. And Matthew's idea was to work together with these other developers and release those games under the Outlaw brand instead of the Palace brand. So we had these two brands. So everything in terms of sales and PR and those kind of things was all one. But in terms of the brand, they were two separate brands. So Matthew created partnerships with Sensible Software. So we released 2 Sensible Software games under the Outlaw brand, which were 3D Tennis and Shoot 'em Up Construction Kit. And then another group that we worked very closely was a group called Binary Vision. And with Binary Vision, we released one of their games called Stifflip and Co. This was Matthew dealing with this rather than me. He was the sort of the contact, the relationship with those other developers.
That was a more traditional publishing business. Like, were they financing those games, like in milestone payments?
Well, I can't remember the exact details, but I think basically they made the games. They would come to us and say, look, this is what they're working on. Are we interested? If we liked the idea, we'd say yes. And then we would make an agreement. We would pay them some money. We would pay them some royalties when the game got released and that sort of thing. So, yeah, it's sort of a standard publishing agreement. And of course, it was quite a big thing for us to make an agreement with Sensible Software because, of course, they were already quite big working together with Ocean. So they were already quite known as a developer. And so, we were very happy to work with Sensible. And we had a great relationship with Binary Vision as well. I mean, they were very, very nice guys to work with.
I guess you were reporting to Nik Powell?
Correct, yeah.
I wonder, what was Nik's expectation for Palace Software?
Well, I think basically just simply to make some profit.
Straightforward.
He liked the idea of computer games. He was a businessman, but he was a kind of creative businessman. So from his background at Virgin, he understood the whole process of creating products. In the case of Virgin, it was creating music and marketing that music. And in the case of Palace, it was creating movies and video games and computer games. So, he just liked the whole idea of it. And as long as we can make a profit, he was happy. But also, he was very good because he would also push me, so once Cauldron was a success in the UK, it was Nik who pushed me and said, go out there to Europe, go to France and Germany and Spain and other countries and sell those games. And so I did. And then later on, to try and license those games in America and Japan and those kind of places. So, so Nik was great to work with in that sense.
Did he expect you to create games based on licenses which he had bought?
I think after The Evil Dead, really the type of films he was licensing weren't really suitable for computer games. So I think, Nik automatically understood that, can you make a game of Fitzcarraldo or those kind of movies? You probably can, but, it's stretching it a bit. I did try there were crazy ideas we had, which we tried, but didn't work. I can remember we tried to tie up with a particular music group and try and make a game of one of their records, but that didn't work. So, it didn't get past, even the sort of idea stage, really. So, no, I don't think Nik really sort of expected that.
So starting with Cauldron, Palace Software had a string of hit games in the 80s. And we're wondering, how were the economics of games in these days? Was it hard to turn a profit with these games?
Once you got a hit, no, it's not. We had Cauldron 2. They both made good profits. But then the real big hit came with Barbarian. So then we hit the gold mine, It just kept on running and sold huge amounts of copies all around Europe. And so that kind of kept us going for a long time. And then, of course, we made a Barbarian 2 as well. These were all Steve's ideas. Steve was behind all of those 4 games, Cauldron 2, Barbarian 2. So, by the time we got to Barbarian 2, the other guys were also throwing in ideas as well. And then Dan started to work on his own game, which was Antiriad. So that was, I guess, I can't remember the sequence, but I guess Antiriad was either before Barbarian 2 or after Barbarian 2, so it was another one of the sort of the sequence of games that made a good profit. I don't think we ever released a game that didn't make a profit. The only thing was that, as the team got bigger, our overheads got bigger. We took on several new offices, so we had bigger overheads. So therefore we had to sell more games to pay for the costs of running the company.
You were overseeing marketing and PR and sales. Do you remember any special tricks you used, any special campaign? How was marketing in those days? Well, was it just advertising in magazines?
Well, no, I think it was a mixture. I mean, obviously, these were the days of magazines. There wasn't online marketing like there is now. So it was pretty simple. But the key thing was PR, because it was a case of making sure that the journalists knew about the games, that they understood the games. So, we were quite confident that the games were good. We just had to make sure that the journalists saw that. So I had to go out and I spent a lot of time on the road in the UK and around Europe, visiting magazines and demonstrating the games. Also, I think the other thing is that some other companies, their games weren't so great. So therefore, they had to really do some tricks with magazines because, the important thing was the reviews in the magazines and getting exposure in the magazines. So, you didn't want to have a little review in the back pages of the magazines. What we wanted was wanted to have a front cover, a review over 2 pages. We wanted to have interviews with the developers, with Steve and so on to have extra coverage, all that kind of thing. So, what I had to do was I had to build up a good relationship with all the different magazines around Europe and make sure that they were behind us and they were on board and enthusiastic about our games. And that generally worked. That was okay. And then, of course, it was then a case of taking out adverts as well. I wouldn't say it was any tricks. I think it was just a case of, it was a process and keeping good relationships with the journalists.
I remember that I specifically liked the covers, like the Cauldron cover. I liked that so much. A very minimalistic cover with a clear centered artwork, and the interior cover was great. And then there was a Barbarian cover.
Well, again, we had the artists. It was Steve and Dan who were making the covers. So that's the other thing we did in-house. It was the boxes. And, of course, Barbarian was the one that was the most controversial one. I don't know how much people in Germany would know about these things. So just to go over the story, it was Steve's idea. The whole Barbarian was basically loosely based on Conan the Barbarian, of course. So what he wanted was a box which would really stand out. So there was a newspaper in the UK called The Sun. I suppose the nearest in Germany would be Bild or something like that. In other words, it's one of those newspapers where you would, whatever you read in the newspaper, you wouldn't believe what it was saying anyway. But it was fun to read, But the key thing about The Sun in those days was page 3. Page 3 of The Sun was a naked woman every day. And it was a group of women, several women who would rotate. So every day, maybe every 2 weeks, there would be the same woman again, and they were in rotation. But the most famous at that time was a lady called Maria Whittaker. So Steve's idea was there was a TV program with these big strongmen guys, and Steve got hold of one of these guys, contacted them and said, how about being on the cover? And then he got hold of Maria Whittaker and said, okay, would you want to be on the cover? And so he put them together in a studio. And Steve did the whole everything, and he even made Maria Whittaker's costumes and all the costumes. He did everything. Costumes. So Maria's costume was minimal, let's say. But Steve was very thrilled by the fact that he had to actually sort of create this costume, and she had to put it on for him, and it kept falling off. And so he enjoyed that session a lot. And we hired a professional photographer and who took many, many photos, and there's so many good photos came back from that photo session, which we could not only use for the cover, but we could use for the marketing. I could show these pictures to magazines around Europe, and they could all choose to use one of these pictures exclusively for themselves, and everyone was very happy about this. So we were just about to release the game, and then I got a phone call from a lady called Jenny Richards. Back in those days in the UK, the biggest single retailer for computer games, which actually is a chain of pharmacies, chemists, called Boots. They're still very big now in every shopping mall and high street in the UK. But they sold computer games in those days. And Jenny was the buyer for Boots for computer games. And Jenny called me and said, hey, Pete, you sent us this game, Barbarian, and it's got this cover on it. And there's no way we could stock this game with this cover on it. So we can't stock it. And I said to Jenny, well, look, how about if we change the cover? So actually there is a different version of the cover. So, for collectors, there is a second copy of the cover without Maria Whittaker on it, with just the Barbarian guy, which was only sold in Boots.
And that's what you did then?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Barbarian is famous for the cover artwork and for Maria Whittaker, but it's also famous for being able to chop off the head of the violence, essentially.
Yeah.
During the development of the game, was that an issue? Were you aware that this might be controversial?
Well, I think we probably were, but, we were just having fun.
Fair enough.
And actually, every time we showed the game to anyone, that was the thing they loved. Oh, I can chop the head off, and great. So we knew that was what kids wanted to do, So, we knew we had to keep it in there.
I had so much fun with this head chopping off. I remember that. So.
Yeah, even I got to, I used to have fun going around showing it to journalists and chopping the head off all the time,
Do you remember, was this an expensive stunt, the photo shoot and the models and everything?
Well, this is the funny thing. Maria Whittaker was a household name in the UK. She was very famous. Steve had contacted her agent. So I can't remember the exact amount, but as far as the agent was concerned, for Maria Whittaker, it was a day's work in a studio, and she had a set fee, a set amount of money that she charged for that. And it was unbelievably small. Once, I think it was something like £100.
Wow.
And then later, when the game came out, because it had been such a big thing with Maria Whittaker on the cover, so we wanted to do some personal appearances with Maria Whittaker. And so again, Steve contacted the agent, and the agent said, "Oh no, for personal appearances, it's a different amount. For that, it's £1,000." So we never did it. So no, in fact, actually, it probably seemed quite expensive for us at the time compared with Steve or Dan making the cover themselves. But actually, really, it was very cheap. And of course, it was a fantastic investment because it helped sell the game and made it into such a huge hit.
Barbarian and Barbarian 2 were picked up in the States by Epix, but they changed the name of both games to Death Sword and Axe of Rage, respectively. Do you remember why?
Well, I can't remember why, but I suspect it's because they probably didn't want any copyright problems with Conan the Barbarian, the movies, I guess. I'm not sure, but I guess that was the problem.
That was not an issue in the UK.
Well, we got away with it. No one complained. So yeah. Yeah. Of course, there was one other problem, because there was, just as we were about to release it, as we were already getting the publicity, I had a phone call from Psygnosis to say, "Oh, they're just about to release a game called Barbarian." So, we ended up agreeing to both release a game called Barbarian.
Impossible. The things that were possible in the 80s. So, can you imagine what your superiors at Konami would have said if you had suggested to bring out a game in parallel with a competitor with the same name?
Another game called Metal Gear Solid.
Yeah.
So, Peter, you mentioned earlier that Palace never released a game which didn't turn a profit. And I think that...
As far as I can remember, yeah.
Okay, I think that brings us to Demoniak, because I think Gunnar mentioned that that's a game that we're specifically interested in. And I don't think we can imagine that this game turned a profit, but I'm curious to hear whatever you remember of that. The thing is that Demoniak as a game is completely out of character for Palace, because the company was firmly rooted in arcade games, as far as I saw, and you've always been striving for high-class graphics. And then you're releasing a text adventure game on the Amiga in 1991. That's madness. And we were wondering how this came about.
Well, I mean, there were other text adventure games. I mean, was there like a Hobbit or Lord of the Rings or something like that?
But much earlier.
Yeah, like much earlier. Yeah.
Well, okay, we were 5 years behind. So as the team was growing, Richard was kind of moving on. Richard and Steve were moving on to other projects within the Palace group, but outside of Palace Software. And so we needed to have a kind of better management of the creation of the games. We knew a lady who was working at Virgin Games at the time, and she had been in the business for quite a long time. She worked at Thorny MI Games at the very beginning of computer games, when they were releasing games from Texas Instruments cartridges. And anyway, so she goes back that far. And her name was Patricia Mitchell. So Patricia was at Virgin, and, we got on very well with Patricia. We used to meet her at different events, and we liked her, and she seemed to like us. So we persuaded her to come and join us. And she took over sort of managing the programming side of things, which, to be honest, by then wasn't going so well. We had too many games that were started to be made and never got finished. And so Patricia was quite tough on all those things. And, she was the person who, I think myself and Matthew were too soft-hearted with the guys. And whereas Patricia was much tougher and would say, "Hey, look, this game isn't working. Let's scrap the game." So Patricia had a friend who was Alan Grant. And Alan was a comic book writer who was quite famous. He had written Batman comics. He was one of the writers of Judge Dredd, 2000 AD. So somehow Patricia, persuaded Alan to write this story. So he did. And then Joe Walker, who had also come on board as an artist, who was a good friend of Dan Malone, he produced the graphics. I think it was Chris Stangroom who did the programming, and Richard Joseph did the music. Oh, and I think another thing was that through Virgin Games, Patricia knew a guy called Simon Birrell. Now, he was a very kind of creative sort of guy. So Patricia persuaded Simon to come and join us. And so I think Simon also worked on Demoniak in some way or another. I think Simon and Alan Grant worked on the manual, but probably other things as well. Yeah, so that's how that game came about. It was, a combination of all those people working on it.
So you wanted to do that? Okay.
Well, it sounded like a good idea at the time. I mean, the thing was that it was Alan Grant. So, and Alan was quite famous as a comic book writer. So there was a certain, already a kind of marketing angle there from the time. Yeah, you're right. I mean, maybe it didn't make a profit, but it was, I'm sure we had good fun at the time.
I'm still hung up on the fact that this is a text adventure game. Whose decision was that? Did Alan Grant say, hey, I'd like to do a text adventure game? I guess not.
I don't know. I mean, by then, you'd have to ask Patricia and Simon, and they would probably remember those things, which I can't remember.
Okay.
Because it was a wildly ambitious text adventure. It was far in ambition, far ahead of everything that had been done. Text adventure games are like linear things, like where you go one room after the other, solve a puzzle. And this game was like 30 characters all simulated at once. And when you read the manual, it clearly points that this is a system that is built to create games with. So at least in the mind of Chris, the programmer, there was a series of those games, of those simulation text adventure game in the 90s on the Amiga. And this is strange.
Yeah. Well, if it had worked, maybe it could have become a whole new genre, text adventures on the Amiga.
I mean, it is interesting precisely because you pointed out earlier that Palace Software was a company which was quick to kill games if they perceived that they wouldn't work or there was no business perspective for these games. And Demoniak is the kind of game that I believe should have been killed, to be blunt. I mean, it's, as Gunnar said, it's a fascinating game, but at that point in time and in that market environment, it's hard to believe that this game would have been a good business decision. So that's why we were wondering how this could be.
Yeah. I can't remember. It's too long ago to remember the conversations we had and the decisions we made on Demoniak. But, perhaps if you speak one day to Patricia or to Simon, maybe they would remember these things. I was with Patricia a few days ago. Myself, Patricia, Richard Leinfelder, we're all still good friends.
And do you happen to remember Chris Stangroom?
I do.
Can you tell us more about him? Because he seemed to be the mastermind behind the adventure system, which, as Gunnar already mentioned, was quite ambitious.
I don't know if you're aware, but Chris actually died.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, we were.
Unfortunately, he was murdered.
No.
Oh.
When he was on holiday, which was very sad because he was still in his early 20s and he was such a nice guy. So sadly, I mean, I have to say that quite a few of the people who worked on these games have all died since then. I mean, okay, Steve Brown is still around, Richard, of course, Patricia, Matthew Timms, and Dan Malone and Joe Walker, they're all still around. But quite a few of the other guys, particularly the programmers, Richard Joseph, for example, died a long time ago. Stan Skembry, who worked on Barbarian, these guys have passed on, which is very sad. And they all died young as well. Richard Joseph was a little bit older, but still, I mean, he was still relatively young, and the other guys died very young, which is very sad.
Indeed, it is. So there's another sad part to this story, and that is the end of Palace Software, and we're also curious about that. I think right around the time that Demoniak was released in 1991, Palace Software was also sold to Titus. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. What actually happened was that this is a sad story. So Nik was producing movies. The movies were getting bigger and bigger, more expensive. He was doing all these deals with studios in Hollywood. And they were kind of, doing quite well, but the trouble is they were a bit too ambitious. They were making perhaps too many movies. And then there was one particular movie, and that movie, they hadn't quite finished the movie. They were nearly finished the movie, but they ran out of money. They completely ran out of money. So the Palace group collapsed. And sadly, I wish I could remember the name of the movie, because what actually happened was that once the Palace group had gone bankrupt, the movie was picked up by a Hollywood studio. It became a big movie. It won an Oscar. And if Palace group had continued for a little bit longer, just a few months longer, they probably would have had a big hit on their hand and everything would have been completely different. but it wasn't. And so all of the Palace companies had gone bankrupt. The only one still operating was Palace Software. So the Palace Software got sold off to Titus, the French company. And so we ended up as part of Titus. And this is the crazy thing. So one day I'm sitting at my desk in my office at King's Cross, and suddenly I get this demand land on my desk for $10 million. And from some movie financing company, because this was owed by the Palace Group, and we were the only company still existing in the Palace Group. But now we were part of Titus. Hervé Kahn, who ran Titus, I called him and told him, he laughed. And he said, okay, well, in that case, we've got to really close down Palace Software and make Palace Software the London office of Titus. And that's actually what happened. So for a short time, perhaps for maybe a year, we were part of Titus. But actually, Titus at that time released one or two good games. So I got to work on one or two Titus games. There was a game which you might be familiar with called Titus the Fox.
Yes, good game.
That was quite a nice game. For the time, that was quite a nice game. So that was one that got released at the time that we were the London office. Okay, we didn't have anything to do with the making of that game, but we were involved in some promotional things and selling the game in the UK. But then after about a year, it kind of wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't the same Palace Software that we created. So it wasn't so much fun. So by chance, I got a call from Konami, and Konami asked if I would like to join them to run their London office. So I talked to them and said, yeah, sure. It was an interesting thing for me. By then, actually, Patricia, who I mentioned earlier, Patricia Mitchell, she had moved on as well. She had gone to Sega. And so I called Patricia and I said, what's it like working for a Japanese company? And she said, well, it's a bit like working for a European company in the 1950s. That's how they think. Anyway, so I tried it. So I ended up at Konami for 27 years.
Excellent.
So Palace in its last year, or in your last year at Titus, it was like mainly distribution for the Titus games.
Yeah, that's right. So Steve Brown had moved on by then. I think, I can't remember what happened in what order, but I know that Joe Walker and I think probably Dan Malone had gone to System 3, and we were working on a game that, in fact, actually, I think that Demoniak actually led to another thing, which was a sort of adventure, but with graphics, like a text adventure with graphics. But while that was being made, the company was taken over by Titus, and Titus didn't like that idea at all. That was completely scrapped. And that was really Simon Birrell's idea. He was the person leading that. But we had another very good programmer called Rob Stevens. He was only about 19 years old, I think, and he was clearly very talented. So Titus wanted Rob to go and work for them. So, at that time I'm still working at Titus. So I hired a van. I packed up all Rob's possessions into a van, and myself and Rob, we drove down to an apartment they'd found in Paris, and so I left Rob in Paris. So that's where Rob ended up at Titus. And Rob had a good time at Titus. He worked for Titus for many, many years. He first worked in Paris, and then they moved him down to the south of France, and he really enjoyed it down there. He was a kid. He'd never gone outside of the UK, I don't think, before going to Paris. But he really enjoyed it. So, and then these guys, were still around. So Dan and Joe at System 3, Rob at Titus, Richard Leinfelder and Steve Brown had moved on to do other things. So, yeah, they were all around. And Patricia had gone to Sega. Yeah.
Well, that was fun. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure talking to you, Peter. Thank you so much for sharing all these memories with us.
Okay, you're welcome.
Das war unser Gespräch mit Peter Stone und hier kommt nun die deutsche Zusammenfassung. Peter Stone, wer ist das? Das ist der Geschäftsführer von Palace Software, aber das war er natürlich nicht immer und relevant ist auch diese Vorgeschichte. Der hat nämlich in den 70er Jahren für Virgin gearbeitet, die Firma von Richard Branson, und zwar als Leiter von Ladengeschäften, denn Virgin hat damit angefangen, dass sie Plattenläden betrieben haben und in dieser Zeit, in der Stone für Plattenläden verantwortlich war, also die gemanagt hat, wurden die auch immer größer und diese Fläche musste gefüllt werden irgendwann, nicht nur mit Platten und Musik, sondern dann auch mit anderen Medien, zum Beispiel mit einem ganz frischen, ganz jungen Medium, nämlich Videokassetten, also VHS, Betamax in dieser Zeit. Und Virgin hatte am Anfang mehrere Partner. Neben dem Richard Branson war das ein anderer Mann namens Nik Powell. Der war auch Peter Stones direkter Boss bei Virgin. Anfang der 80er hat Nik Powell Virgin verlassen und seinen Mitarbeiter, seinen ehemaligen Untergebenen, den Peter Stone, angerufen und gesagt, hey, das, was du da mit diesen VHS-Kassetten gemacht hast in den Stores, das ist doch eine gute Idee. Magst du nicht mitkommen? Ich mache eine neue Firma auf. Wir machen ein neues Ladengeschäft und verkaufen dann nur Kassetten, nur Videokassetten. Ja, und so kommt's dann auch. Dieses Geschäft heißt The Video Palace. Das ist erst in Kensington in London und später dann in der Oxford Street, also einer der Haupteinkaufsstraßen von London. Und Peter Stone kommt da also mit, um auch hier wieder den Laden zu managen. Das ist allerdings nur ein Teil von diesem neuen Unternehmen von Nik Powell. Denn aus diesem Ladengeschäft wird bald eine Firmengruppe und die heißt Palace Group. Nik Powell fängt an, nicht nur Videokassetten zu verkaufen, sondern auch Lizenzrechte einzukaufen für Filme, für den Vertrieb in England. Von Arthouse-Filmen, Sachen von Wim Wenders, französische Filme und auch Genrefilme, darunter zum Beispiel Horrorfilme wie The Evil Dead, also Tanz der Teufel von Sam Raimi und John Carpenters Halloween. Und dann wird das Ganze mal größer, dann beginnt er auch selber Filme zu machen, er gründet eine eigene Produktionsfirma und im Laufe der 80er wird also diese Palace Group größer und größer. Und am Anfang steht eben dieser Laden, The Video Palace, und da ist es wieder ein ähnliches Problem wie bei Virgin auch. Viel Fläche, Zeug muss da rein, das Sortiment wird erweitert und Peter Stone beginnt nun da also auch Computer zu verkaufen, also Hardware. Wir sind hier Anfang der 80er, da ist das immer noch ein relativ junges Feld. Der erste Computer, an den sich Peter Stone erinnert, den er im Sortiment hatte, war ein Heimcomputer von Sharp, der MZ80, eine 8-Bit-Maschine, die heutzutage nicht mehr sonderlich bekannt ist, die keine große Breitenwirkung hat. Aber da kamen dann andere Sachen dazu, dann hat er auch Software verkauft und hat festgestellt, die Kinder, die dort Computer geschenkt bekommen oder gekauft bekommen, meistens von ihren Eltern, die kommen wieder in den Laden zurück, zum einen, um da vielleicht Software anzugucken, zum anderen aber auch, um die Programme zu tauschen, die sie selbst geschrieben haben auf diesen Maschinen. Also vor allen Dingen samstags wird The Video Palace auf einmal zu einer Art Tauschbörse für Computerprogramme. Tja, und der Nik Powell und der Peter Stone, die haben zwar keine große Ahnung von Videospielen, aber Ahnung von Vermarktungen und dachten sich, also diese Jungs, die verkaufen ihre eigenen programmierten Spiele über Anzeigen in Computerspielemagazine und mit laienhaft zusammengepackten Packungen und sowas. Das kann man doch professioneller machen. Da könnten wir doch Computerspiele verkaufen. Aber wo kriegen wir denn welche her? Wir brauchen jemanden, der uns Spiele schreibt. Ja, und dann traf es sich, dass in The Video Palace ein junger Mann arbeitete namens Richard Leinfelder. Der ist Student zu dieser Zeit, der ist Elektronik-Nerd. Er hat jetzt noch nicht so viel Erfahrung mit Programmieren, aber das bringt es sich dann bei. Und gemeinsam gründen Richard Leinfelder und Peter Stone dann eine weitere Tochterfirma von Palace, nämlich Palace Software. Die brauchen ein eigenes Büro dafür und da trifft es sich, dass Nik Powell einen Partner an Bord geholt hat, nämlich Steve Woolley. Der leitet ein Kino in London im Stadtteil King's Cross, das Scala-Kino. Das ist ein lokales Programmkino und das bringt er in dieser Partnerschaft mit in die Palace-Gruppe ein. Und dort in diesem Kino, dort beziehen also Leinfelder und Stone 2 Räume. Hat den Vorteil, dass sie jederzeit ins Kino dürfen. Ja, da laufen jetzt zwar keine Blockbuster, aber trotzdem schön. Im Laufe der Zeit werden das auch noch mehr Büros werden, aber nicht in dem Scala-Kino. Da gibt's nicht genügend Platz, sondern dann in anderen Häusern im Umkreis. Jetzt haben sie also einen Programmierer und ein Büro. Jetzt fehlt eigentlich nur noch ein Spiel. Und der Vorschlag, was sie tun könnten, also der Themenvorschlag, kommt laut Peter Stone von Nik Powell, vom Chef von Palace. Der hat nämlich, wie gesagt, Lizenzen eingekauft, unter anderem für diesen Horrorfilm The Evil Dead und sagt, Mensch, Jungs, macht doch damit ein Spiel. Tja, und so machen sie es dann auch. Richard Leinfelder programmiert, Peter Stone macht die Grafik, weil ist sonst kein anderer da. Und seiner Aussage nach macht er das ziemlich schlecht, weil er nämlich kein Grafiker ist und da kommt am Ende laut Stone auch kein gutes Spiel dabei raus. Aber es ist immerhin ein Anfang und es kommt da eine Erkenntnis dabei rum, nämlich, dass sie jemanden brauchen, der talentierter ist, was Grafiken angeht auf diesen 8-Bit-Computern. Wir sind hier im Jahr 1984, wo The Evil Dead erscheint, wir sind auf dem C64. Und jetzt setzt Peter Stone eine Anzeige in eine Zeitung, um nach Grafikern zu suchen. Er hat da spezifisch was im Kopf. Er möchte nämlich Künstler, die einen Comic-Stil haben, im Stil von 2000 AD, ein Comic-Magazin aus England der damaligen Zeit. Weil er nämlich der Meinung ist, dass sich der Comic-Stil gut in Pixelgrafik auf den Computer übertragen lässt. Und darüber finden Sie den Steve Brown und darüber finden Sie später auch den Dan Malone, auch über so eine Anzeige. Lustigerweise erzählt Peter Stone, dass der Dan Malone sich aber da nicht drauf beworben hat, sondern dass dessen Dozentin von der Uni angerufen habe und gesagt hat, sie hatte hier jemanden in der Klasse, der ist in dem Kurs völlig fehl am Platz, aber der ist ja ein fantastischer Comic-Künstler. Dann schickt sie den Malone zu Palace Software, der kommt da mit seinem Portfolio an und wird auch sofort genommen. Nun, auf jeden Fall heuern sie also erstmal den Steve Brown an als Grafiker und der macht mit Richard Leinfelder zusammen das zweite Spiel von Palace Software, nämlich Cauldron, hier in Deutschland Hexenküche genannt, und das wird dann ein Erfolg. Und auch hier pusht wieder der Nik Powell, der Chef von der Palace-Gruppe, der sagt nämlich zu Peter Stone, pass auf, wir müssen vermarkten, wir müssen in den Vertrieb, bring das mal bitte international raus, dieses Ding. Geh mal ins Ausland und such dir da Vertriebspartner. Ja, und so macht der Stone das auch. Unter anderem geht er auch nach Deutschland und findet dort den Quelle-Versand aus Nürnberg als Vertriebspartner. Und das Spiel kommt hierzulande also in der deutschen Version raus als Hexenküche und ist in Deutschland sehr erfolgreich. Wobei, wir haben den Peter Stone dann auch gefragt, wie sehr sich der Nik Powell denn da eingemischt hat oder was seine Erwartung war an Palace Software. Und Stone sagte, naja, also eigentlich war die Erwartung, dass es Geld macht, dass am Ende Profit dabei rumkommt. Ansonsten hätte er sich nicht groß in kreative Entscheidungen eingemischt. Aber er pusht eben Peter Stone, gerade in Sachen Vertrieb und Vermarktung. Aber Palace hat auch Erfolg. Das Cauldron und der Nachfolger Cauldron 2 sind erfolgreiche Spiele. Antiriat kommt dann auch erfolgreich, machen guten Gewinn, also genau das, was Nik Powell sehen möchte. Und der große Hit für Palace Software ist dann Barbarian. Da erinnert sich Stone, dass sich das über längere Zeit hervorragend verkauft hätte, überall in Europa. Wie generell Peter Stone in der Erinnerung meint, dass Palace Software überhaupt kein einziges Spiel rausgebracht habe, das nicht profitabel war am Ende des Tages. Wir haben dann nochmal Demoniak reingeschmissen, von dem wir uns nicht vorstellen können, dass das ein profitables Spiel war, aber da hatte er dann keine Erinnerung mehr dran. Naja, also wir haben eine Firma hier, die also stark um Grafiker herum gebaut ist. Die Grafiker machen übrigens auch die Covermotive für die Spiele. Und Steve Brown, der zuständig war für Barbarian, der hat also auch das Cover verantwortet von Barbarian. Dieses berühmte Cover, in dem der halbnackte Barbar und die halbnackte Prinzessin drauf sind. Peter Stone erzählte, Steve Brown, der kreative Kopf hinter Barbarian, der wollte eine Box, die im Handel heraussticht. Und der hat dann selbst diesen Muskelmann organisiert, der irgendwie aus dem Fernsehen bekannt war, und Maria Whittaker, die einigermaßen bekannt war in England als Seite 3 Girl von The Sun, die größte Boulevardzeitung in England damals. Ja, Steve Brown hat die angeworben, hat sogar die Kostüme gemacht, also den Lendenschutz für den Barbar und das Bikini für die Maria Whittaker. Das sei wohl bei den Fotoaufnahmen ab und zu mal runtergefallen. Das Bikini, da musste wieder repariert werden. Also Peter Stone meinte, Steve Brown hätte sicher viel Spaß gehabt bei diesen Fotositzungen. Die waren übrigens in einem Studio von einem professionellen Fotografen und es kamen am Ende so viele gute Fotos dabei rum, dass sie auch in der PR verwendet werden konnten. Und dann ist also Peter Stone, der verantwortlich war auch für viele von den Pressebesuchen, konnte dann den ganzen Redaktionen immer ein exklusives Bild anbieten von Maria Whittaker für ihre Berichterstattung. Generell sagte die Maria Whittaker, das war damals ein bekannter Name in England. Aber für Palace Software war das ein richtiges Schnäppchen. Also es sei unglaublich günstig gewesen. Dieses Fotoshooting hätte sie 100 Pfund oder sowas gekostet. Also ein Spottpreis, insbesondere für den Effekt, den es nachher hatte. Aber dann wollten sie, nachdem Barbarian draußen war und dann schon ein erfolgreiches Spiel war, dachten sie, na, da könnten wir die Maria Whittaker ja mal für ein paar Live-Auftritte buchen. Und dann hatten sie den Agenten am Telefon und der sagte, ja, aber das ist ein ganz anderer Satz. Da kostet es dann 1000 Pfund am Tag. Ja, und dann hat Palace Software dankend abgelehnt und hat also Maria Whittaker nicht live auftreten lassen. Aber für das Cover war das eine hervorragende Investition. Und sie kam ja für den Nachfolger Barbarian 2 dann auch nochmal zurück aufs Cover. Das Barbarian war generell ein Spiel, um das sich einige Anekdoten drehen, die Peter Stone erzählt hat. Zum Beispiel, dass der größte Einzelhändler in England, bei dem auch Spiele im Angebot waren damals, nämlich eine Drogeriekette namens Boots, das abgelehnt hätte. Das Spiel, da sei die Einkäuferin, eine Frau namens Jenny Richards, bei ihm im Telefon gehangen, hätte gesagt, ja, ihr habt uns da dieses neue Spiel geschickt, Barbarian, mit dem Cover können wir das bei uns nicht in die Regale stellen. Und deswegen hat Palace Software dann eine eigene Variante gemacht, also ein Cover, wo nur der Barbar drauf ist, und das ist dann bei Boots gelaufen. Wie Pete Stone dann amüsiert sagte, das ist was für die Sammler. Und kurz bevor Barbarian dann in den Markt kam, gab es auch noch einen Anruf von Psygnosis, einer anderen englischen Firma, die dann festgestellt hatten, wir haben auch ein Spiel in der Entwicklung, das demnächst rauskommt. Das heißt auch Barbarian, zufälligerweise. Und dann habe man sich halt einfach darauf geeinigt, dass dann halt 2 Spiele rauskommen, die beide Barbarian heißen. Dass Barbarian ein polarisierendes Spiel sein würde mit dieser Mischung aus sexy Cover und Gewaltdarstellung im Spiel, das sagt Peter Stone, das war ihnen vermutlich schon bewusst, aber eigentlich wollten sie einfach nur Spaß haben. Und was es aber sehr relevant wohl war für Palace, sie haben schon vor der Veröffentlichung des Spiels beim Probespielen gemerkt, dass das in der Zielgruppe richtig gut ankommt, das mit dem Kopf abschlagen. Ja, da waren die Reaktionen hervorragend, also war ihnen schon klar, das wird populär werden. Spätestens dann durch Barbarian und den Erfolg von Barbarian wächst die Firma. Palace Software stellt mehr Leute ein, mietet dann auch noch mehrere Büroräume im Umkreis von dem Scala-Kino an, hat also auch mehr Verwaltungsaufwand, muss deswegen mehr Spiele verkaufen, der Preis des Erfolgs. In der Zeit entwickelt sich auch eine Arbeitsteilung zwischen Peter Stone, der Geschäftsführer ist, und einem Mann namens Matthew Timms. Auch so ein Mensch, der vorher im Video Palace gearbeitet hat, also in der Ladenkette, und dann zu Palace Software rübergewechselt ist, und der hat auch so eine Art Managementrolle, wie Peter Stone sagt, nämlich ist er erstmal überwiegend fürs Marketing zuständig, aber im Laufe der Zeit tauschen die beiden, Peter Stone und Matthew Timms, immer mal wieder so die Rollen hin und her. Der Stone ist zunächst neben seiner Geschäftsführertätigkeit auch quasi der kreative Direktor, also derjenige, der die Aufsicht auch über die Entwickler hat. Und das geht dann sukzessive an den Matthew Timms über, dafür macht Peter Stone dann mehr Sales und Marketing und eben auch die PR, der besucht dann die ganzen Magazine überall in Europa, weil er auch sagt, zu der Zeit waren Vorberichterstattung und Tests waren die wichtigsten Marketing-Tools für Palace, neben halt Anzeigen und sowas. Deswegen war es ihnen wichtig, eine gute Beziehung zu Magazinen zu pflegen. Und der Matthew Timms auf der anderen Seite, der entwickelt dann die Idee, dass man ja auch mit externen Entwicklern zusammenarbeiten könnte und startet sozusagen den Publishing-Arm von Palace Software, ein eigenes Label, eine Untermarke namens Outlaw Productions. Da werden dann Spiele veröffentlicht von externen Entwicklern, vor allen Dingen von Sensible Software. Die machen dann für Palace Software 3D-Tennis und das Shoot'em-up Construction Kit. Da ist übrigens Peter Stone im Nachhinein ziemlich stolz darauf, dass sie Sensible Software bekommen haben für diese 2 Spiele, weil die waren damals durchaus schon ein bekannter Name. Die hatten nämlich 1987 Whizball rausgebracht für Ocean, ein Mega-Hit der damaligen Zeit. Dann wurden die nächsten Spiele eben über Outlaw Productions bei Palace veröffentlicht. Aber während das Unternehmen wächst, wachsen dann auch Leute raus. Der Richard Leinfelder zum Beispiel, Mitgründer, zentrale Figur in der Entwicklung, der schon früh aus der reinen Programmiererrolle rausgewachsen ist in so eine Art Tech-Director-Rolle, der verlässt das Unternehmen. Zu viele von den Spielen, sagt Peter Stone, auch seien unterwegs versandet. Also Palace Software hat keinen sonderlich guten Track Record, wenn es darum geht, auch Spiele tatsächlich rauszubringen. Und der Leinfelder, der war eben auch in so einer Art Producer-Rolle für die Entwickler, und diese Rolle muss jetzt neu gefüllt werden. Deswegen heuert Peter Stone dann Patricia Mitchell an, die er von Virgin Interactive abwirbt. Es scheint sich zu bewähren für Palace Software, Leute von Virgin rüberzuholen. Da kommen ja Peter Stone und Nik Powell auch her ursprünglich. Da sind wir jetzt Ende der 80er schon, also ungefähr 1988. Stone sagt, er und Matthew Timms, sie seien zu weichherzig gewesen mit den Entwicklern, hätten ihnen zu viel durchgehen lassen und sie brauchten eine strengere Hand. Das sei die Patricia Mitchell gewesen. Und da kamen wir dann auch zur Geschichte von Demoniak, was das letzte Spiel von Palace Software war, das 1991 rauskam, über das wir eine Staffel Stay Forever Spielt gemacht haben und viele Fragen dazu hatten zu dem Spiel. Und leider erinnerte sich Peter Stone aber kaum daran, war halt wie gesagt ein spätes und auch nicht so bedeutendes Spiel. Aber er wusste noch, dass die Patricia Mitchell, die sie da neu dazugeholt hatten, die kannte den Alan Grant, den Comic-Künstler Alan Grant, der dann die Rahmenhandlung schrieb für Demoniak. Und so sei er also ins Projekt gekommen. Und der Rest war in-house. Der Joe Walker war der Grafiker, ein Freund von Dan Malone, Chris Stangroom, der Programmierer. Also wie gesagt, Peter Stone konnte uns leider nicht sehr viel zu Demoniak sagen, hauptsächlich eben zu dem Alan Grant. Auch von ihm haben wir gehört, wie auch von anderen, dass Chris Stangroom, der Programmierer, dass der schon gestorben ist und dass er ermordet wurde, während er im Urlaub war. Peter Stone erinnert sich an ihn als einen wirklich sehr netten jungen Mann. Nun kommen wir schon zum Ende der Geschichte. Nik Powell und seine Palace Group und vor allen Dingen sein Filmproduktionsarm Palace Productions produzieren Ende der 80er, Anfang der 90er immer größere und größere Filme. Die Ambition ist, Hollywood-Niveau zu erreichen. Und dann kommt ein Film, der bricht der gesamten Palace Group das Genick. Peter Stone erinnerte sich nicht mehr an den Namen, aber dieser Film ist The Crying Game, der 1992 rauskam, aber die Palace Group hat das schon nicht mehr erlebt. Der ist nämlich durch die Produktion von diesem Werk das Geld ausgegangen und im Endeffekt ging also die ganze Gruppe auch daran bankrott. Das Crying Game kam dann trotzdem raus, der Film, unter einem anderen Studio später und wurde ein erfolgreicher Film, hat sogar einen Oscar bekommen für das beste Drehbuch. Aber davon hatte die Palace Group nichts mehr. Naja, und Palace Software als Teil dieser Gruppe wurde verkauft an Titus Interactive, an die Franzosen. Und das hätte jetzt da eigentlich einfach unter neuem Eigentümer weitergehen können, wenn da nicht kurz darauf eine Mahnung reingeflattert wäre auf den Schreibtisch von Peter Stone von einer Filmfinanzierungsfirma, die sagten, hier, ihr schuldet uns $10 Millionen. Natürlich schuldete Palace Software niemanden $10 Millionen, aber die Gruppe eben, und Palace Software war die einzige Tochterfirma, die noch übrig war aus diesem ganzen Konstrukt, wenn halt jetzt auch unter neuem Eigentümer. Peter Stone erzählte, dass er dann den Hervé Kahn angerufen hatte, den Chef von Titus, und der hätte gelacht und gesagt, ja sorry, dann bleibt uns nichts anderes übrig, als Palace Software zu schließen. Dann wurde also Palace Software geschlossen und die angestellten Büros und so blieben aber dann halt als Londoner Dependance von Titus Interactive. Also der Name Palace Software und diese Firma waren damit vorbei. Der Peter Stone blieb noch ungefähr ein Jahr lang in dieser Dependance unter Titus Interactive. In die Zeit erinnerte er sich vage, fällt auch der Nachfolger zu Demoniak, der da noch in der Entwicklung war. Er wusste da jetzt nichts Spezifisches mehr, außer dass er glaubte, dass das von Titus Interactive eingestellt worden sei, weil sie da nicht dran geglaubt hätten. Da haben wir aber auch noch andere Stimmen dazu gehört. Wer sich dafür interessiert, das ist eine sehr faszinierende Geschichte, ein faszinierendes Spiel. Der erfährt das in unserer letzten Folge zur Stay Forever Spielt Staffel zu Demoniak. Das ist eine offene Folge, die kann man bei uns auf Patreon und Steady frei anhören. Aber auf jeden Fall sagte Peter Stone, in dieser Zeit, also es sei einfach nicht mehr das Gleiche gewesen. Viele Leute sind dann schon gegangen. Wie gesagt, der Richard Leinfelder war schon weg. Dann waren auch Steve Brown und die Grafiker irgendwann weg. Patricia Mitchell war dann zu Sega gegangen. Und schließlich ging auch Peter Stone, wechselte rüber zu Konami, um dort die Londoner Zweigstelle zu leiten. Und das hat er dann auch die nächsten 27 Jahre lang gemacht. Und er erzählte, dass in dieser Zeit, wo alle dann weggegangen sind von Palace Software, dass da auch ein junger Programmierer namens Rob Stevens, der die C64-Version von Barbarian 2 geschrieben hat, dass der dann nach Frankreich gehen sollte, weil Titus Interactive ihn dringend erhalten wollte als Programmierer. Der war wohl ein Talent. Und dann hatte Peter Stone kurzerhand einen Transporter gemietet und sie haben alles eingepackt von dem Rob und er hat ihn persönlich nach Paris gefahren, wo Titus ihm schon eine Wohnung zur Verfügung gestellt hatte. Und dort hat Rob Stevens dann auch lange Jahre gearbeitet. Also man merkt, das kam in dieser Erzählung schon immer wieder raus. Das war für die Jahre lang, wo es Palace Software gab, war ja nicht ganz ein Jahrzehnt, muss das eine sehr gute Gemeinschaft gewesen sein. Eine Art Männer-WG, würde ich jetzt sagen, denn ich glaube, bis Patricia Mitchell kam, gab es nur Männer in der Firma die ersten Jahre. Auf jeden Fall hatte Palace Software ein sehr enges, ein starkes Team im Haus, im Gegensatz zu vielen anderen Herstellern in England in den 80ern, die Spiele eher eingekauft haben, wo die Programmierer dann noch zu Hause saßen oder Freelancer waren oder sowas. Und hier gab es wirklich ein zentrales Team, die sehr, sehr viel miteinander gemacht haben und wo vor allem im Mittelpunkt die Grafiker als die zentralen Ideengeber und Figuren standen. Und das war wohl eine starke Partnerschaft. Außerdem sagt Stone, hätte es auch geholfen, dass sie nach The Evil Dead keine Lizenzspiele gemacht hätten und dadurch viel größere kreative Freiheit hatten. Wir haben dann auch gefragt, ja, warum eigentlich keine Lizenzspiele mehr? Ich meine, bietet sich doch an, Palace hat doch diese ganzen Videolizenzen gekauft. Und Stone sagte, naja, die Filme, die Woolley und Powell da eingekauft haben, die waren dann doch zu nischig, um für Spiele zu taugen. Sowas wie Fitzcarraldo zum Beispiel, der Klassiker von Werner Herzog mit Klaus Kinski, das macht da mal ein Spiel draus. Möglich, aber nicht vielversprechend. Und sie hätten durchaus auch die eine oder andere Sache mal versucht. Also zum Beispiel erinnert er sich, dass sie versucht haben, zu einem Album einer populären Musikgruppe ein Spiel zu machen, was dann aber nicht funktioniert habe. Also wir kommen wieder drauf zurück. Palace Software hat offensichtlich eine ganze Reihe von Sachen gemacht, die nie das Licht der Welt erblickt haben. Und generell meint Peter Stone, war Palace Software in dieser Palace-Gruppe eher so eine Außenseiterfirma. Es gibt ein Buch über Palace, über die Palace-Filmsparte. Das heißt The Egos Have Landed, The Rise and Fall of Palace Pictures von Angus Finney. Das stammt von 1996 und da wird die Geschichte von Palace Productions erzählt. Und Peter Stone sagt, der Autor hatte offensichtlich null Ahnung von Spielen, denn alles, was er über Videospiele und über den Videospiele-Arm schreibt, sei falsch. Ich habe es nicht nachgelesen, ich kann es nicht beurteilen, aber es spricht auch dafür, dass das eher der Wurmfortsatz war in dieser Palace-Gruppe. Aber vielleicht hat das eben auch wieder dazu beigetragen, dass sie relativ autark ihr eigenes Ding machen konnten und damit ja auch einige Jahre lang sehr erfolgreich waren. Und ja, dieser enge Zusammenhalt scheint tatsächlich sich auch erhalten zu haben, denn Stone hat uns beiläufig erzählt, dass er mit Richard Leinfelder und Patricia Mitchell immer noch befreundet ist. Und das war die Zusammenfassung von unserem Gespräch mit Peter Stone. Ich hoffe, es hat euch ein paar Erkenntnisse gebracht. Für uns war das sehr spannend. Und damit wünsche ich euch noch einen wunderbaren Rest des Tages. Wir hören uns bei der nächsten Folge. Bis dann.